folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching.
Welcome back to the history of New Orleans. We last left off in April of 1862 with the Union Navy steaming past the twin forts of Jackson and St. Philip. These forts had been the last line of defense for New Orleans, and despite a valiant effort from the defenders, they simply lacked enough firepower and manpower to hold off the invasion. The citizens of New Orleans, for their part, were blissfully unaware about how much danger they were in. Last they heard, the forts had sustained little damage after 6 days of Union bombardment, and surely as long as the forts remained intact, there would be no cause for alarm. Their spirits were even raised when the mighty ironclad, Louisiana, made her way out of the dry dock to turn the tide of the battle. She would certainly soon be followed by another battleship of equal or even greater power, the Mississippi. It makes sense that the city should pin so much hope on these two ships and the two forts, since the military situation inside the city was appalling. All the so-called soldiers that remained in New Orleans by the end of April were old men, uncommitted foreigners, free black volunteers, and untrained boys. All of these men lacked cohesive structure and weapons. If the Union troops made it to the city, there would be no hope of resistance. On the morning of the 24th of April, the alarm bells sounded across the town, dumbfounding the residents, who definitely did not expect the situation to turn so suddenly against them. There was no widespread panic among the average citizenry, mainly just disbelief and a numbing dread. The same cannot be said of the military and government leadership. They ran around in absolute panic, attempting to extricate themselves and important documents from the city as soon as possible. When General Lovell returned to the city just ahead of the approaching Union army, he did not order a general defense by the few ragtag regiments within New Orleans. Instead, he wanted to make sure that once the Union captured the city, that they would get as little of value as possible. To this end, he ordered his troops to burn the cotton, burn the ships, and burn the shipyards. The flames and smoke snapped the civilians out of their stupor, and a general run on anything not burned began. They swarmed over the city like rats, and by the time the Foreign Brigade was called in to restore order, there was nothing left to protect. It had all been destroyed or looted. This was all done within 24 hours of news of the defeats at Fort Jackson and St. Philip. The next day, further action was taken to liquidate the wealth of New Orleans. The banks sent any hard specie they had on hand, along with the gold and silver reserves of the mint, by railroad out of town. This amounted to over $6 million, or what today would have been over $187 million. The looting of the city continued at a more methodical and limited rate, but by now it was more motivated by frustration that the politicians and generals were making their great escape than by panic. Ironically, it was not the invading army that sacked New Orleans, but her own people. While the people of New Orleans were ransacking the town, the Union fleet was taking their sweet time sailing up the river. By the 24th, the bulk of the fleet was just 18 miles downriver of the city, and were approaching the batteries at Chalmette, the site of New Orleans' heroic stand against the last invading force that had threatened her in 1815. At Chalmette, a pathetic collection of obstinate men decided to make a final stand with 14 small cannons that were the only artillery left in New Orleans. The underwhelming battery managed to cause one Union sailor to fall off the deck of his ship, but that was the sum total of the impact these final holdouts had. The fleet kept slowly sailing north. Admiral Farragut, commander of the Union fleet, finally set foot in New Orleans on the afternoon of the 25th. He was welcomed by a hostile mob of locals, who were none too happy to be receiving the admiral, but could not act on their emotions, seeing how the fleet's guns were leveled directly at their homes. Representatives of the admiral made their way to City Hall, where the flag of the state of Louisiana was flying proudly. These men presented Farragut's demands to Mayor Monroe, the city council, and members of the Committee on Public Safety. These demands were that the city should surrender to the Union forces, the flag of Louisiana should be replaced with the American flag, and that the mint should be handed back over to the federal government. The Confederates were obviously not enthusiastic about having to capitulate to these demands, and they did everything they could to make the process as painful as possible. First, Monroe said that since the city was technically still under martial law and he was just a civil servant, he had no authority to give in to any of these demands. This meant that the military commander in charge of the city, that being General Lovell, had to be called over to City Hall to negotiate with the Union representatives. Lovell was at this time preparing to hightail it out of the city, but he was coerced into coming back to City Hall. Once there, he passed the buck back to Monroe by saying that he would not surrender the city, but that he would withdraw his troops so that power could return to the hands of the civil authority. This time to the city council, who agreed that they would meet at a later time to properly discuss how they would proceed. What they decided at this later meeting was that they could not find an honorable way to submit to the Union at this point, and that they would have to reconvene the next day to continue the discussion. This whole ordeal was understandably frustrating to the Union officers. They had complete military superiority in New Orleans at this point, and there was really no leverage which the Confederates could use to negotiate terms. All this hemming and hawing was just the leaders of New Orleans trying to find a way to save face in the reality that they were completely helpless. On both sides, the men in charge were exchanging pleasantries and assuring one another that their highest interest was to treat the people and property of New Orleans with the utmost respect that they deserved. This was all done through gritted teeth, as shown by the fact that Farragut said that he personally did not believe that anyone should be punished just because they were loyal to the Confederacy, but that if any violence was committed against his men, then he would not hesitate to order his artillery to level the city. Understandably, things were a little tense. The people of New Orleans, those not just trying to get on with their normal daily lives, were constantly menacing any Union troops who stepped off their ships. Union officers were beginning to get more and more irritated with the delay of the city's formal surrender, and all it would take for some serious bloodshed to occur is one small spark. Yet for now, cool heads were prevailing. Farragut and Monroe, for all their differences, still held a semblance of respect for each other's position. It is at this moment that into our story steps Major General Benjamin Butler, commander of the ground troops attached to the Union fleet. I think it's important to go into the background of Benjamin Butler to fully understand why he acted the way he did in New Orleans. Little baby Benny was born in Deerfield, New Hampshire in 1818. His father was Captain John Butler, who had coincidentally served under Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. After his service in the Army, John Butler became a privateer in the Caribbean. We don't know the exact details of his time raiding on the high seas, but we can guess that given the timing and proximity to New Orleans, that John Butler was at least aware of the famous figure from our story, Jean Lafitte. Anyway, we don't really care too much about John because he died of yellow fever shortly after his son was born. After the death of the family patriarch, the Butlers moved to Lowell, Massachusetts, where Benjamin's mother opened a boarding house to provide for her two sons. Young Benjamin, now growing up without a father, quickly gained a reputation as a headstrong and insubordinate troublemaker who never really wanted to do anything that anyone else told him to do. Someone trying to say something nice about him would say that he wanted to cut his own path through life. Someone not trying to be nice and being a bit more realistic would describe him as a bully. What better career for someone who enjoyed being right and enjoyed berating those under him than as an officer in the army? So instead of becoming a Baptist minister like his mother wanted him to, Benjamin sought to become an officer in the U.S. military. Unfortunately, he did not qualify to enter the prestigious West Point Military School, and so he changed course and became a criminal defense lawyer, where at least he could spend his days arguing. While studying to become a lawyer, Benjamin became more and more involved in politics, leaning towards the Democratic Party. Now keep in mind this was the Democratic Party in Massachusetts, where slavery had been abolished in 1783. Up north, the Democrats were seen more as a populist working man's party than a pro-slavery party. Sure, they supported slavery to follow the party line, but it was an issue of secondary or even tertiary importance to their constituency. Meanwhile, Butler started his own law practice in Lowell and quickly rose to prominence as a criminal defense lawyer thanks to his ruthless nature. While expanding his law practice and investing in private business, Butler remained active in politics. At first, his involvement was simply that as an interested private citizen, but in 1852 he received his first post in public office when he was elected to the Massachusetts state legislature as a supporter of both the Democratic Party and the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers were a party created around the idea of stopping the spread of slavery to the newly acquired Western Territory. They were an anti-slavery party, but they did not, however, support the idea that the federal government should have the power to abolish slavery in states where it was still legal. Despite the fact that Butler ran on a platform of a coalition between Democrats and Free Soilers, he did not hold many Free Soil ideas. He was at this time still pro-slavery, as evidenced by his support of John Breckinridge in the 1860 presidential race. However, this support was timid. Butler believed that it was a state's right to decide on the issue of slavery, but he did not support secession. Ironically, this led him to briefly shift his support to Jefferson Davis, who was considered a more moderate Democrat. Yes, that is the same Jefferson Davis who would become the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. In the end, neither of Butler's picks would win the presidency, and it would be Abraham Lincoln who stepped into the office in 1860. This is where it is important to remember that Butler was not a secessionist. He famously stated that he was a friend of Southern rights, but an enemy of Southern wrongs. In this era of clearly defined political lines, Republican or Democrat, slavery or freedom, Union or secession, it can be hard to square Benjamin Butler. He was first and foremost headstrong. Whatever his opinion on a matter was, you were sure to know it, because he would tell you straight to your face what he thought. He was at times both an idealist and a pragmatist. He supported both the public good and his own private interest. He was a man of contradictions, but he never questioned himself. For example, Butler believed wholeheartedly in the Union. While visiting Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1860, he ran across a delegation of secessionist South Carolina delegates. He then brazenly requested to the then lame duck president, James Buchanan, that he should arrest these delegates under charge of treason, showing his colors as the brash idealist. Around the same time, Butler realized that war between the North and South was imminent, and so he procured from the Massachusetts state government a contract to supply the state militia from cloth from a mill that he owned. Eventually, Butler would gain quite a profit from the Civil War, showing his colors as a shrewd pragmatist. But Butler's interest in the war was not purely for personal material gain. He desperately wanted to fulfill his dream of serving in the U.S. Army, so he managed to use his connections that he had built up over the course of his legal career to get himself named Brigadier General of a regiment of the Massachusetts Militia, despite the fact that he had no prior military experience. His first assignment came a week after the capture of Fort Sumter started the Civil War. There was anxiety within the Union that the nation's capital was in danger. Previously, we may note that New Orleans was not a viable option for the capital of the Confederacy, in part because it was in such a vulnerable position. Well, Washington, D.C. was practically within the borders of Maryland, and they hadn't seceded from the Union, but they were a slave-holding state, and this brought their loyalty into question. To secure D.C.'s position, regiments of the Massachusetts militia were sent to Baltimore and Annapolis. It was Butler's regiment that was assigned to Annapolis, but when they arrived at the outskirts of the city, the governor of Maryland told them to come no further. He was afraid that pro-Confederate elements within the city would use the presence of Union troops to incite a riot. Any other officer in the U.S. Army might have thought carefully about this possibility, but as we will see later in New Orleans, Butler had no patience for traitors and criminals. Against the governor's protests, he landed his men in the city and occupied the Annapolis Naval Academy. While presiding over Annapolis, and later Baltimore, Butler continued his reputation as a bully. He threatened the civilian population that refused to supply provisions for his troops by pointing out that his soldiers had guns, and this meant that it was really an option between selling the army provisions or having them taken by force. Either way, Butler would get his way. He also used the presence of troops to strong-arm the state legislature into voting not to secede. From the very beginning of the Civil War, Butler established himself as a controversial figure. It was undeniable that his heavy-handed tactics were getting quick results in the Union Army, but the press in the South decried him as a prime example of Northern tyranny. After securing transportation lines between Baltimore, Annapolis, and D.C., Butler was reassigned to garrison Fort Monroe, which guards the mouth of the James River, which offers a direct line to the Confederate capital of Richmond. It was a very important task to be given to an officer who lacked any field experience against enemy troops, but Butler's political connections and success in Maryland worked in his favor to secure him such a vital task. It was while in command at Fort Monroe that we get another peek into how Butler's desire to bully the Confederacy manifested itself in a positive way. In order to keep the door open for the Confederate States to hopefully rejoin the Union, it was the official policy at the start of the war to respect the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and to return any runaway slaves that made it to Union lines. Butler, however, had a different idea. He reasoned from his experience as a lawyer that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a part of the legal code of the United States of America. By seceding from the Union, the Confederacy and all the slaves within it were no longer a party to this law. Furthermore, he argued that since the Confederates considered their slaves to be property rather than people, and since they were using the slaves to build fortifications and construct lines of communication for the war effort, then they could technically be seized as contraband of war. Butler used logic and legal precedents instead of a moral argument against slavery, but the result was still good. By the time his tenure at Fort Monroe came to an end, the federal government approved of his methods and instituted them throughout the rest of the Army. From now on, slaves that escaped to Union lines would not be returned to the Confederacy. But it was not all good news at Fort Monroe. Butler's inexperience led to this phase of his military career being an overall setback. He blundered into a Confederate ambush just a few weeks after arriving at Monroe, and he was subsequently forced to give up the ground to the Confederates. Luckily for Butler, he would narrowly escape losing his commission over this debacle, and got the chance to prove himself again when he led an expedition to North Carolina. This time he achieved more lasting success and regained his reputation as an effective commander. After North Carolina, it was back to Massachusetts for a recruiting stint. It was here that Butler's penchant for self-aggrandizement put him in a sticky situation. He was not satisfied with just giving himself a commission in the Army. He also tried to play the role of patron by doling out positions to his brother and some of his friends. This did not sit well with Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, and their public conflict would delay Butler's redeployment, which meant that the post he was supposed to fill in Virginia was already filled by the time he was ready to depart. Instead, he got the job of leading the ground troops that would invade New Orleans, which meant that once the Navy cleared Fort St. Philip and Jackson, that it was his job to administer the city under military occupation. Immediately there was a visible difference between the tact of Farragut and the bullying of Butler. Just like in Maryland, Butler understood two things: that the local population was hostile to the Union's presence, and that they couldn't do squat about it as long as Butler's men had their guns. So while Farragut and Mayor Monroe exchanged letters with flowery language dripping with sentimentality and good old Southern chivalry, Butler was preparing to beat the rebels into submission as soon as they stepped one toe out of line. The first instance of insubordination of the New Orleanians came while terms of surrender were still being hashed out. Captain Morris of the U.S. Pensacola made the symbolic move of raising the American flag over the Mint in New Orleans. Whether he did so under orders from Farragut or Butler, or by his own volition, we don't know. Whatever the case, it caused a big stir among the locals. 4 New Orleans men removed the flag and brought it down to a crowd that had formed on the street. This crowd enthusiastically tore the flag apart and handed out strips of it as trophies. In response, the U.S. Pensacola fired a round of grape shot over the crowd to disperse them. It could have been the igniting incident for a general riot in the city, but Farragut and his representatives tried their hardest to smooth over the Confederates' ruffled feathers. Butler, on the other hand, made it instantly known that he would publicly execute anyone involved in the desecration of the flag. But it was not up to Butler just yet. He was still making his way to the Crescent City, while Farragut and Monroe were dueling each other with prose, and the two forts, although bypassed, were still holding out from being captured. Farragut, for his part, was becoming increasingly frustrated with the intransigence of the city government. His hope was that in order to cause the least amount of trouble for both sides, the government should recognize that resistance was futile, and that their best course of action would be to legally surrender the city so that they could remain in power, just under the supervision of the Union instead of the Confederacy. However, the pride of the mayor and the city council could not accept this. After 4 days of fruitless negotiations, Farragut threw up his hands and said, "Fine, if you wouldn't bend to reason, then you will break under force." Force arrived when Butler came to New Orleans on May 1st at the head of 6 fresh Union regiments. He and his men were greeted by a less hostile crowd than their comrades in the Navy had, as the people of New Orleans had begun to accept the fate of their occupation. Although, this acceptance did not mean that they weren't sullen and resentful. They remained committed to passively resisting the federal takeover of New Orleans, as exemplified by the events on May 2nd. The day started with Butler making his way to the St. Charles Hotel, where he planned to set up his base of operations. The manager of the hotel informed Butler that the entire staff had been laid off prior to the occupation and that the hotel was closed. Butler was not the same diplomatic negotiator as Farragut was. He was a bully. He informed the manager that he was seizing the hotel on behalf of the U.S. Army with no compensation to the previous owner. When a crowd gathered to protest this seizure, Butler had his troops disperse the crowd and arrested 2 men. The time of the soft-handed approach was over. But nobody let the mayor or the city council know that the rules of the game had changed. They continued to treat Butler with the dismissive, faux polite attitude they had for Farragut. When he summoned them to discuss matters at the St. Charles, they took their sweet time getting there, trying to prove that they did not serve at Butler's whim. When they finally did show up, they discovered that Butler had not called them to discuss terms, but to dictate his demands. He opened by declaring that all the people of New Orleans were rebels, which was just a fact as they had seceded from the Union. However, the municipal government immediately protested this characterization. Butler held firm to his pronouncement and continued to issue a proclamation that laid out his vision for the occupation. The city would be under martial law, all citizens of New Orleans would be disarmed, only the American flag could be flown, even on private property. All the wealthy and influential people of New Orleans would have to take an oath of allegiance to the United States. Business was to continue as normal, meaning no work stoppages to protest the occupation. Anything deemed a disruption of peace or a crime against the Union would be prosecuted by a military tribunal, while all other crimes would continue to be prosecuted by the municipal courts. This amounted to basically the unconditional surrender of all power and authority in the city to Butler and his officers. There was concern among the ruling class of New Orleans that the current administration would lose credibility if they continued to serve their posts under Butler's rule, but the mayor and the city council believed that they could better serve the community by working under Butler rather than resigning and giving him an absolutely free hand. As it turned out, this debate was completely inconsequential, since Butler was already issuing general orders to the city that made him de facto dictator of New Orleans. But his motivations were not entirely despotic. Butler's driving contention was that the people of New Orleans, especially the politically and financially powerful, had betrayed the United States, profited from the deprivation of its people, and murdered Americans in the pursuit of serving their own perverse social order. So his general orders sought to inflict as much damage as possible on the elites of New Orleans, while also protecting the poor and innocent. The most infamous of his orders were General Order 25 and 28. 25 was more of a statement or threat towards the wealthy. It contended that they should use their ill-gotten wealth to help the less fortunate, or Butler would seize their property and do it himself. Order 28 was made in response to incidents involving the well-to-do ladies of New Orleans treating the occupying troops with the utmost contempt and insulting them at every opportunity. It declared that any woman, despite her station, who insulted a soldier or officer of the United States should be treated as a woman about town plying her vocation, which is 1860s speak for prostitution. Order 28 in particular really soured Butler's reputation. Public figures from Confederate President Jefferson Davis to the British consulate in Washington issued statements of disgust with how the poor, unfortunate women of New Orleans were gravely injured by this conduct. Note that none of these public figures made much note about how poorly women of color were treated in the South for the last 200 years. Mayor Monroe was among those that protested against Butler's mistreatment and misrepresentation of the well-to-do ladies of chivalrous and civilized society. Unfortunately for him, unlike Jefferson Davis and the British consulate, he was within reach of Butler's power to punish. Yes, good old Mayor Monroe sent one of his famous verbose and sanctimonious letters to Butler, and in response received handcuffs and a trip to the cells at Fort Jackson. The removal of the mayor was followed, less than a month later, by the dismissal of the city council. The members of the city council had either served out their terms or refused to take the oath of loyalty to the United States, and so the body was dissolved in late May. Instead of holding elections to replace the mayor and the council, Butler announced that there were not enough loyal American citizens in New Orleans to trust them with the sacred duty of selecting their own representatives, so they would be chosen by the staff officers of the Union Army. This was the solidification of the military dictatorship in New Orleans. There was no longer even the veneer of democratic representation with Butler's administration. Nowadays, we, sitting in the safety of our homes in the 21st century, can be quick to decry the actions of Butler. He was inarguably despotic, sometimes cruel, and was not in the least bit hesitant to use his position to enrich himself and his friends. However, we must also acknowledge the context of 1862. Although New Orleans would not see combat for the rest of the Civil War, the rest of the state and the surrounding country was still embroiled in the bloodiest conflict in American history. At this point, Butler could not be sure that there wouldn't be a future Confederate siege of New Orleans, and if his grip over the city wasn't absolute, then the seditious attitude of the populace could prove fatal to him and his men. Furthermore, as a general in the U.S. Army, he had a duty to his men and to his country to protect them from rebel elements. Now, whether you agree with him that the best way to go about this was to relentlessly bully the wealthy Confederate men and women of New Orleans or not, we can point out that Butler's brief administration of New Orleans secured Union possession of the city for the rest of the war. The task of assigning blame or praise on the actions of Butler is further complicated by his enemies. These were, first and foremost, the Southern aristocracy, which controlled the historical narrative before, during, and after Butler's tenure in New Orleans. The loudest and most repeated complaints against Butler were his conduct with these powerful people of the city, his seizure of their property, his insults towards their honor and dignity, and his insistence that they were solely responsible for the travesty of secession in the Civil War. These prominent citizens lambasted Butler in the papers and in the historical record, pinning all of their grievances with federal rule in the South on him. It got to the point that in December of 1862, after only 8 months in control, Butler was relieved as military commander of New Orleans and recalled to New York. But at least he had the opportunity to experience the birth of one of New Orleans' iconic destinations, because it was in 1862 that Café du Monde began serving their famous beignets in the French market, so that is a silver lining to him being in office. Upon departing the city, Butler issued a final public statement summing up his opinion of the Confederacy, the war, slavery, and Southern aristocrats, saying, "The enemies of my country, unrepentant and implacable, I have treated with merited severity, and that I hold that rebellion is treason, and treason persisted in is death, and any punishment short of that due a traitor gives so much clear gain to him from clemency from the government." His address also showed how his opinion on slavery had evolved since the outbreak of the Civil War. Whereas before he was content to allow the South to continue the practice as long as it didn't interfere with the maintenance of the Union, now he said, "Look around you, and say whether this saddening, deadening influence has not all but destroyed the very framework of your society." Suffice it to say, this address did not leave the wealthy slave owners of New Orleans with a good opinion of Butler upon his departure. With Butler's exiting of the city, there was a loosening of the military dictatorship's hold over New Orleans. The army did, however, continue to occupy the city for quite some time in order to make sure that rebellious sentiment would not return. As the opportunity for elections returned to New Orleans and the other Union-occupied zones of Louisiana, there was a reemergence of politics. These politics were centered almost entirely around the process of reintegration with the United States. Since this was the only real possibility for the future of Louisiana, it meant that the political energy in New Orleans was vested in those few Union sympathizers in the city. This constituency was mostly poorer white men, since people of color and women still couldn't participate in politics, while rich white men were still stubbornly loyal to the Confederacy. Even within such a limited constituency, there were wedge issues that split them into two distinct parties. The first party's platform revolved around the assertion that the secession of Louisiana had nullified the state constitution of 1852, and so before any reunification could commence, there would need to be a constitutional convention to draw up a new framework for the state. The main reason this group wanted a new constitution was that it would be the easiest way to ensure the abolition of slavery prior to the state rejoining the Union. That meant that this party was deemed the Free State Party. The second party, who still supported reunification, believed that the Constitution of 1852 had just been suspended when the state seceded, and so it should be the basis for new elections, and the provisions regarding slavery should remain intact. At this point in time, President Lincoln had already proclaimed the emancipation of all slaves in the South, but the opposition party, also known as the Conservative Party, believed that this was just a public relations move to boost the morale of the Union Army, and not a legally binding resolution. Neither the Free Staters nor the Conservatives had any real power at this point in 1863. As a consequence of the question of civil government, reunification, and slavery came down to General Nathaniel P. Banks, who had taken over from Butler as overall commander of the Department of the Gulf. His first prerogative, above all else, was the speedy installation of new civil government to ease the tensions in New Orleans and the rest of occupied Louisiana that were growing under martial law. This resulted in him following a sort of middle path between the two parties. The Free Staters wanted elections for delegates to a constitutional convention to occur in January of 1864, with the convention convening at a later date, and only after this new constitution was ratified would there be general elections for municipal offices. This was much too slow for General Banks, and so he decided that the Constitution of 1852 would remain in effect, minus its provisions on slavery, and that elections for public office would occur in February of 1864, which would then be followed by a constitutional convention. We might ask, what was the reason behind the haste in which the Union wanted to reinstate civil government? Sure, there was the obvious fact that the military occupation was widely unpopular, and the longer it operated with at least tacit approval through elected officials, the more likely there was for general revolt. There was also a less obvious fact, that in 1864, the Union had control of only a fraction of Louisiana. Within the territory it held, there was only 18% of the state's total population of 700,000. Sure, it had the important centers of political and economic power in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, but most of the state remained in the hands of the Confederacy. The concentration of the occupation into such a small area was actually a boon to the Union. They held much more control over the future of the state when they only had to worry about 18% of its population, most of which was in New Orleans. So if the framework of the state could be shaped before the Union had to worry about the other 575,000 or so citizens, they could steer Louisiana in their desired direction. As it turned out, the all-important gubernatorial race came down to three candidates. The Free Staters split on the issue of having a later election versus the earlier one, and so they nominated two men, while the Conservatives nominated one. In the end, the Free State candidate who supported the early election won handedly with nearly 63% of the vote in New Orleans. 3 days after the governor was sworn into office on April 3, 1864, a constitutional convention of 98 delegates representing 19 parishes convened in New Orleans. It would take this convention 2.5 months to draw up a constitution that was pretty much a copy of the 1852 Constitution. Of course, the important difference was that slavery was abolished, and slave owners would not be compensated by the state for their freed slaves, though the federal government would later pay these slave owners for their loss of so-called property. The Constitution also expanded the state public school system to include black people, and while the voting franchise remained only in the hands of white men over the age of 21, it did leave the door open for future state legislatures to expand the franchise to those they saw fit. This obviously fell short of true civil liberty, but within the context of the American South in 1864, it was a baby step forward towards equality. On September 5th, the Constitution was ratified by a general vote. In New Orleans, the support was overwhelming, with 4,664 for it and 789 against it. There was, however, one important point of contention within the Constitution. It stated that should the Constitution not be ratified, or if there needed to be any amendments added at a later date, then the same group of delegates would be reconvened to make such changes. This point was added to make sure that even once the rest of the state rejoined the Union, that the Constitution would be written and controlled by the Union's sympathetic delegates. As we will see later, this created the opportunity for strife. In the meantime, New Orleans was emerging from 4 years of governance under mayors appointed by the military. These men were variable levels of competent and controversial, but on the whole did not make enough of a difference in the life of the city to warrant going into detail. In the early months of 1865, there was a struggle between the recently elected Governor Hahn and the newly appointed military commander, Major General Hurlbut, which resulted in Hahn's resignation and his replacement by Lieutenant Governor Wells. Wells wanted to shift focus away from what was essentially a military coup by reinstating municipal elections in New Orleans. To this end, he set March 12th as the date when a new mayor, comptroller, street commissioner, recorder, and alderman would be elected for the first time since secession. The 1865 election brought forth a plethora of political parties with a hodgepodge of positions. There were the National Democratic and Democratic Conservative parties that split on the same issue, the 1852 Constitution, that the Free Staters and Conservatives had split on. There were also the Radical Republicans, who supported the new Constitution, but wanted to use its provisions on voting rights to expand the franchise to black people. They were opposed by the National Conservative Union Party, who supported the 1864 Constitution, but did not want to extend the franchise. Rounding it all out was the Democratic Party, a branch of the National Party that had existed since 1828. This was the party of secession, and in case there were any questions about why they seceded, they explicitly wrote in their party doctrine that, quote, "This is a government of white people, made by and to be perpetuated for the exclusive benefit of the white race, that people of African descent cannot be considered as citizens of the United States, and that there can, in no event, under no circumstances, be any equality between the white and other races." Needless to say, this party was not open to the expansion of the franchise. In the end, the mayoral race came down to a contest between two tickets, the more liberal National Union ticket and the conservative Democratic ticket, with each party lending their support to one or the other. The National Union nominated James H. Moore for mayor, while the Democrats nominated former mayor and recent Union prisoner John T. Monroe. Monroe ended up winning his second term off the back of the popularity he gained by standing up to the Union occupiers during his first term. The election was competitive with only 311 votes separating the two frontrunners, but notably there were no disturbances at the polls, unlike the bloodshed that had regularly occurred before the Civil War. This can likely be attributed to the presence of federal troops along with the normal police presence. Monroe began his second term in office with a mandate from the Democratic constituency to keep power in New Orleans in the hands of white men. If they couldn't enslave black people, then they would sure as hell make it as hard as possible for them to exercise any of their unalienable rights. However, Monroe had a higher power to answer to, and no, I don't mean God. I'm talking about the federal government of the United States of America. Louisiana was still 2 years away from becoming a real state again. For now, it was still under the jurisdiction of the military commander of the Department of the Gulf. He could at any point depose Monroe and appoint his own mayor. This is precisely what happened on March 19th, when Monroe and the rest of the newly elected officials went to City Hall to be sworn in. Monroe was informed that he was still under investigation for rebellious sympathies that he had allegedly vocalized when New Orleans was captured, and that he would be replaced by Alderman Clark for an indefinite period until his case could be resolved. This period ended up only lasting about 2 months, at which point President Andrew Johnson personally overrode the military governor's order. Now that Monroe was officially in office, he had a number of urgent issues that needed attending to. Public safety was at an all-time low, as the police force was so much of an ineffective body that the mayor allowed private citizens to carry concealed weapons just to defend themselves from criminals on the streets. But the greatest threat to the city was certainly the sorry state of its finances. Aside from the hit the economy took from the Civil War and the blockade, the end of slavery cut a huge hole out of New Orleans' economy. These two issues alone would be enough strain on any administration, especially one so tenuous as Monroe's, but political forces beyond the borders of New Orleans would soon push him past the breaking point. We must recall the Constitutional Convention of 1864, and how it was adjourned with the stipulation that the body may be reformed at any point in order to revise the document. Well, in 1866, this stipulation came into play when the national mood turned towards universal manhood suffrage. It was a few months before the period commonly called Radical Reconstruction started, but there was already a premonition that the new elections would result in a government heavily committed to the complete restructuring of the social order. Wanting to be ahead of the curve, in July of 1866, members of the convention put into motion a plan to unilaterally reconvene. Were their actions legal? No. Could they be considered treasonous? Probably. But were the motives behind their actions morally correct? Absolutely. The context that we must be aware of is that these so-called radicals were foregoing the proper channels of democracy and the rule of law because they knew that the white electorate of Louisiana would never extend the franchise to black people willingly, and so it fell to extra legal means to do the right thing. The rule of law goes out the window when the morally correct action is against it. The mere mention of the convention was enough to turn the racial tension that had been simmering in New Orleans for quite some time to a boil. Contemporary press and later racist historical records would point to radical white leaders nefariously whipping the black population in the city into a frenzy. This was obviously done to stoke fear among the white population of dangerous black men and to remove agency from people of color who only needed to look at the way they had been treated for hundreds of years in order to become agitated and were not led from a life of peaceful coexistence by rabble-rousing white people. These reports had their effect, as rumors spread of numerous assaults on poor innocent white people and violent mobs of black people parading through the streets. Should we take these rumors at their word, or should we perhaps consider that the elites of New Orleans who spread them had a vested interest in stopping black people from achieving the right to vote and fighting for their other rights? Monroe, for his own part, hoped that he could use the power of his office to prevent the convention from meeting. His given reason for this position was that he was afraid that both the black and white populations of the city were so on edge at this point that it was certain that there would be violence at the convention. He also reasoned that the convention was convening illegally, so it should just be dispersed rather than protected. The military governor disagreed and told Monroe that any action taken by the police to try and interrupt the convention would be met with arrests by the military. Seeing that he had no chance of winning in a confrontation with the occupying federal troops, Monroe wiped his hands of the whole ordeal and informed the governor that any trouble that occurred would be on his head now. In response, General Baird told Monroe that he would supply a contingent of federal troops to protect the convention and prevent any disturbances in New Orleans. To this end, he was woefully unsuccessful. When the convention finally convened on Monday, July 30th, it was not federal troops who gathered outside the Mechanics' Institute where the convention was being held, but a large group of unarmed supporters, most of whom were recently freed black men. These supporters congregated peacefully in front of the Institute, supposedly to prevent any disruption of the proceedings within. However, at around 1 o'clock, a mob of former Confederate soldiers approached the Institute. These men were carrying arms under the excuse of Monroe's approval of private citizens carrying weapons for their own protection. Within minutes of the two groups meeting, shots were fired and a full-on battle ensued between white protesters, policemen, and convention supporters. The massacre that followed saw at least 38 people killed. 34 of these were black freedmen, while 3 were convention delegates and one was a white protester. A further 146 people were wounded. The police and the city government were quick to lay blame on the convention and their supporters, while the federal troops, who arrived too late to stop the violence, relied on eyewitness accounts to center the blame on the Confederate agitators. General Sheridan, military governor in charge of New Orleans, placed blame both on the convening of the convention, which he said stoked resentments within the city to the point where they could not avoid a violent confrontation, as well as Mayor Monroe, who he said did nothing to prevent the attack, and who allegedly antagonized the people of New Orleans by hiring murderers for his police force and allowing vigilantes to carry weapons in the streets. The immediate result of the massacre was the canceling of the convention. There would be no constitutional reforms to expand the franchise. It seemed as though the Confederate sympathizers in New Orleans had won. However, the events of July 30th reverberated across the country, turning public opinion against the South and their inhumane treatment of people of color who just wanted the basic right to participation in government. This led to the landslide victory of the radical Republicans in the elections of November 1866, and the subsequent passage of the Reconstruction Bill over President Johnson's veto in early 1867. This was the beginning of radical Reconstruction, and it would see immediate and dramatic changes for Louisiana that would trickle down to New Orleans. For one, the bill reorganized the South into 5 military districts. Louisiana was grouped in with Texas under the 5th Military District, to be governed absolutely by General Sheridan. It was determined that the white population of Louisiana would not allow their recently freed slaves to gain the rights that they themselves enjoyed, so it would be under military force that these rights would have to be given. An addendum to the Reconstruction Bill in March of 1867 stripped the right to vote from any male who participated in the Confederacy, while giving the right to vote to everyone else regardless of race, color, or if they had been enslaved. Notably, this still did not include women. Now that Louisiana was firmly under the boot of General Sheridan, it was obvious to anyone that Mayor Monroe was not long for this world. In fact, it only took Sheridan a week to exercise his new power and give Monroe the boot. It was the 5th time that Monroe had been removed from office, and it would be the last. He decided that his health could not endure such stress, and he gave up politics for the remaining 5 years of his life. I find Monroe to be an interesting foil to the military administrators of New Orleans. He was, by contemporary accounts, a man of steadfast convictions. Even when it would have been advantageous personally for him to renounce his loyalty to the Confederacy, he refused to do so and ended up imprisoned for it. To his supporters, he was a perfect example of a Southern gentleman, always polite, always looking for a way to solve problems that would allow all parties to retain their dignity. He never used underhanded political tactics, and he never tried to use his position to enrich himself personally. He was a public servant through and through. Arrayed against him were all the military strongmen, from Butler to Sheridan, who are described in the historical record by having quite a few more character flaws than Monroe. Butler in particular was undeniably a bully, a tyrant, and unscrupulous in his dealings. However, what Monroe lacked and what these less chivalrous men had was a morally superior mission. All the service that Monroe faithfully executed was to benefit a Confederacy who betrayed the Union because they could not stand to live in a society that wasn't built upon the ownership, degradation, and abuse of a whole race of human beings. What good are manners and ethics if they serve an immoral cause? Should we really denounce the brutal ways the military treated the rebels when it was necessary to secure the freedom of the enslaved? These are questions that the people of New Orleans will have to consider as we move into the Reconstruction era next episode. So please join me next time for the history of New Orleans.